Peggy 18.
Violent video games have encouraged the killing of innocent people for sport.
Remember, no rush.
The gaming industry began its meteoric rise in the early 1970s, with the introduction of home games consoles, a new pastime and form of entertainment available to the public was born. Over the next 40 years, the video game industry has grown to become the biggest form of entertainment, outselling music and movie industries combined, with predictions suggesting it is set to grow even further in the future. From its beginnings, developments in technologies and increased budgets fueled by public demand for video games have resulted in great changes in the types of games we play. Increased graphics capabilities have allowed developers to produce games in an ever more realistic style, from the highly pixelated characters of Sonic and Mario in the 80s and early 90s to the almost lifelike 3D characters we have today. The nature of the games we play has also changed dramatically over the years, fueled by the public's appetite for games containing violence and transgressive practices. Back in 1993, the release of Mortal Kombat 2 led to a moral panic over violence in video games. At this time, the gaming industry was centered around children, with very few adult games being produced. Mortal Kombat involved scenes of extreme violence where players could rip the heart out of opponents, and blood and gore were key selling points. At this time, outcries over such content led to the introduction of the Entertainment Software Rating Board (ESRB) in America and Pan-European Gaming Information (PEGI) in Europe. These organisations apply age ratings to games, indicating the sort of content included and whether they are suitable for children. As a result of this, and public pressure, the makers of Mortal Kombat 2 released two versions of the game, with one version featuring green blood with the most extreme scenes removed, and the other, original uncensored version. Highlighting the public's demand for realism and gore, the version featuring red blood outsold the censored green version by 5 to 1. This public appetite for transgressive, violent video games is reflected today with games such as Grand Theft Auto, where players are required to commit violent and illegal acts in order to progress through the game, and Call of Duty, a highly realistic war simulation, which includes a highly controversial level where players play the role of a terrorist who shoots innocent people at an airport. These two have become the most popular game franchises on the market today, and despite age ratings being applied, a large number of the players are children and teenagers. The increased realism and violence in games has led to concerns from academics, parents and politicians as to the effect these games can have on children. A string of high-profile incidents involving violent acts committed by teenagers whom were known to play violent video games has led to a moral panic over the effect violent video games has on young people.
911, what's your emergency?
Yeah, I think there's a shooting at my school.
We have units on the way. Can you find the perpetrator, the men with a gun?
No, not really. Like, it seems like a lot of people out here.
Can you tell me where you are? How many people? Can you see the perpetrators? Can you see the guys with the guns? Are you inside or outside?
On the 20th of April 1999, at Columbine High School, two senior students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, armed with shotguns, started firing on fellow schoolmates, killing a total of 12 students and one teacher, injuring 21 others before both committing suicide. In the aftermath of the event, speculation into the killer's motivation for the attack wielded many different theories, one of which was how violent video games played a role in inspiring the killer's rampage. It was highlighted that both were fans of the Doom video game, which is a shoot 'em up where players take the role of a lone gunman who roams corridors shooting anything they encounter. It was said that Harris had made levels for the game in the shape of the high school and used it to practice the events. These claims upon investigation have never been proved. Families of the victims, in response to the attack, filed a lawsuit against game makers, saying that without these games this event would have never happened and violent video games turn children into monster killers. This lawsuit was, however, unsuccessful due to video games not being under product liability laws. A more recent incident happened on the 14th of December 2012 at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Much like the Columbine shooting, it involved a young gunman massacring indiscriminately anyone who he came across before committing suicide. In total, the shooter, Adam Lanza, killed 20 children and 7 adults, including his mother. Once again, in the wake of the shooting, the debate over violent video games surfaced with the report that Lanza frequently played violent games such as Call of Duty, with suggestions that playing these games had given him a false sense of courage as to what he could do that day. A subsequent investigation into Lanza's gaming habits revealed that he rarely played games of a violent nature, Super Mario Bros. And Dance Dance Revolution being his favourite. The shooting also raised criticisms of gun laws in the US for renewed calls for the abolishment of the Second Amendment and a person's right to bear arms. The National Rifle Association, in defence, and to deflect attention away from gun control, publicly laid the blame on violent video games, saying that they glorify and create a culture of violence, and virtual weapons were more of a danger to society than real ones.
There exists in this country, sadly, a callous, corrupt, and corrupting shadow industry that sells and stows violence against its own people through vicious, violent video games with names like Bulletstorm, Grand Theft Auto, Mortal Kombat, and Splatterhouse.
Adding to the public concerns over violent video games has been a large number of studies that appear to suggest that playing video games can cause children to become violent. The most common theory is that violent video games increases aggression in children and thus their susceptibility to use violence. Various studies support this hypothesis, and a variety of lab experiments have been conducted which appear to show a link. Research from Brock University in Canada into 13 and 14-year-olds found overexposure to violent games weakened empathy in others. A recent study by Anderson in 2014 concluded that repeated exposure to violent video games can increase aggression by increasing aggressive thinking. In his book, Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill, Grossman claims that violent video games are conditioning children to be violent through desensitization to the realities and consequences of violence. As a further point, he refers to violent video games as murder simulators, and children playing violent shoot-em-ups like Call of Duty are being taught the very mechanics of killing. For every piece of research which claims that there is a link between video games and violence, there is another study which rejects the link, finding no conclusive evidence that playing violent video games can cause children to become violent. A 2012 study by Puri found that, in fact, players of role-playing games displayed more empathy and less aggression than those who did not play games. In the book Grand Theft Childhood, the authors conducted a 2-year study of over 1,200 middle school children and found the common beliefs that video games cause violence to be unfounded, with no data to support the concerns. They concluded that parents, politicians and researchers place too much emphasis on the role of video games and too little on the other issues involved in youth violence.
Children who play violent video games, does this show any link to behavior of violence?
Right. Parents hear all the time in the media that things like the Columbine killings or the Virginia Tech murders are somehow linked or triggered by violent video games. And the evidence just isn't there. So you can relax a little bit about the big, scary things. The Secret Service, the FBI, others have done reports looking at, is there a pattern to these school shootings? Is there a link to violent media? And they have found nothing that suggests that. These kids have a lot of other problems. In fact, with the Virginia Tech case, in the report, the roommates of this poor young man said that we found it odd that he never joined us playing video games.
Oh, okay.
It could be seen as a marker of his social isolation, in fact.
That makes sense.
So parents shouldn't worry about a child just going on imitating something that they see in a game. We don't see a lot of kids out there with Uzis in the street, even though most kids are playing violent video games especially.
Many studies also suggest the positive impact of playing video games, stating it can act as a form of catharsis and an outlet for aggressive feelings, thus reducing the risk of children becoming violent. The video game industry has become the folk devil in the moral panic of youth violence, being blamed by the media, politicians and academics for turning children violent and dangerous. This despite the fact that with the massive rise in video game popularity there has been a drop in violent acts committed by children. With such conflicting evidence concerning video games' effects, and with the methodological and ethical issues involved when assessing children's aggression in a laboratory, no conclusive answer can be given and the debate is set to continue into the future.